Hello everyone, today we resume our Historian series content. Those of you who have been following me from years know that every once in a while I make these videos about kind of more philosophical, scientific, kind of moral issues. That's how I like to frame them. Really, they're always history related in a way, but they stem obviously from the questions that arise from let's say, of course, what we can't get from history applied to, practical realities. There are some of you who contact me and that say, there is something in the way you frame things, you explain them, that somehow helps objectively to deal with something more than just, history. Like, I know that at least history intended as a story more than else, right? It's obvious that most people would find, and I see it from the stats, my channel through the strictly historical, kind of research, interest, and whatever. However, that's not where the channel starts from, at least as an end. Just per se, it's not just a merely informative documentary channel per se. Of course, there is a lot of that as well, because not just I am a historian myself, and so I like to, of course, expand in areas where I think, and that's what can explain, in fact, this whole thing, the world through what happened, but also, talking about things that are normally not presented to us anymore, for many reasons, but that, as I try to explain today, get down all to one core issue, right? There is a sort of emptying of knowledge. That's where it gets down to. You can speculate also on the semantic differences between knowledge, wisdom, science, etc. There are, say, in our languages, of course, different things, but as far as the kind of originary thoughts of those preceded us, and that still had that kind of unitary take and approach to reality, that I think is the only way not to be a moral relativist. If anything, I mean, it's also a scientific principle. We don't search for answers just to making up reality through that. We want to sort out reality, and there are naturally some problems in that, because we are limited, and brutally so. Thus, there is a lot of pain, a lot of negative aspects come from that in our everyday life, that we cannot avoid by a degree, or at least it seems, because of course there is always kind of an absolute potential in which you realize there is a spectrum where we fall in by some degree. But the confidence that of course can stem from the transcendental realization that there is actually a truth, and that doesn't matter how say too often distant from us because of our poor cognitive means it is, still this thing exists, and great part of what our existence, in fact, revolves around is exactly trying to sort that out. Now, it's obvious we are living in a time in which the capacity to get closer to the truth seems, I think most people agree with this, and at all kind of levels of the ladder, right? You often say the majority of people, has appalling standards and whatever, but I think it's fair to say, because if anything, we know it's not a cultural thing. I mean, it's a biological thing. Our genes make us always to seek for order, right? To make order out of chaos. This is even probably not just finding a sort of image, right, a background picture that tells us more or less the thing, but that brings us to be involved in the actual recompaction of the world under our control. And as you know, in my kind of imperial Catholic etymologically meant traditional view of the world, that's basically what, in fact, we can reconnect to what simply science tells us about how humans are built and how they behave and why and so on. And this is already an interesting aspect to start from, because of course science is, let's say, for mostly for cultural reasons at this point, telling the truth, debated to the degree, of course, some people deny the validity of science or see science as a problem or as a alter to traditional knowledge. This is, in my opinion, a mistake. I mean, the fact that we can know more about, just even the fact. I agree that there is a dramatically materialistic orientation of science intended as normally the larger group, right? The kind of, say, at least the background that most of those would deal with what are called hard sciences has historically been influenced dramatically. We know it from Marxism. It's not a conspiracy theory. We are all pretty open about that. We know it from both sides of the aisle. Also because very often these people actually use that. I'm not saying that, if you're a scientist, you have to fall in that. It's not true. I mean, I come from a humanistic background, and pretty much the same thing is usually told. But there are also different, in fact, worlds, different cultures, different academic backgrounds, traditions, and so on. So the world is complex enough, after all, for providing us still, at least especially in the West, kind of a useful substratum of information, of knowledge, also its accessibility, that still works, right, in a healthy debate. Right. The main problem is always that middle ground, say, between science and people in general, and this is obvious for everyone, right? Science meant maybe the scientific community academically and the masses, but it can be literally, the scientific datum and the scientist in the laboratory. I mean, it's that universal as an issue in many ways. So. What I refer to specifically is that, and I don't think this is a positive symptom at all, a sort of regression in the confidence, because that's where I think it all gets down to, right? I think civilization is measured in confidence, right? The more paranoid you are, and the more culturally inferior you are. This is what I believe deeply. I haven't seen exceptions so far. It's a concept that I've been developing over the years, but that I like very much to test when it comes to individuals, because it's always the thing. We can have Newton's gravitational laws written on science school books, but if, let's say, schools collapse as an institution or they become ineffective by a degree, how do we keep science going in that regard? Because it's the people at the end of the day. And in my opinion, the main problem, let's say, when it gets to science, of course, is a matter of method, right? To me, you can, again, use science in different ways, right? You can talk about the community of scientists in general, can talk about science as an amount, let's say, a pool of information, of the data that we have gathered about what. Right, we could say the universe, but you say universe, you think they're just talking about astrophysics or something. No, I mean, science is really knowledge, just per se. That's actually the etymological meaning of the word, right? And it does include actually any other subject. History is science per se. We use a scientific method to study it. We have a kind of standardized, like all subjects, let's say, that are academically recognized are treated equal in that regard. This concept that things like math, physics, or chemistry, etc., are just, hard sciences, because, there's something there you cannot fundamentally go against just per se. It just reflects as a statement the complete ignorance in the complexity of scientific debate in those fields themselves and how important they actually are, right? But it doesn't mean that non-hard sciences, or whatever that is supposed to mean, poses, for example, politology, sociology, history, whatever, to a level where you can basically venture into them without any adequate background and treating it as a sort of personal opinion. I mean, to me, a person, for example, that denies the neurobiological differences between men and women is, at the same level of flat earther. And yet, you see these sort of cults developing within today's world that are designed exactly to undermine, fundamentally, the methodological order and literally the scientific hierarchy of information, for the purpose, at the end of the day, of essentially destroying civilization, right? This may sound like strange, like Wiz trying to destroy civilization right now. Over the years, and this stems mostly from the, some observations that can stem from myself to basically everything I've known in my life, mostly talking with people. That's the thing that surprisingly enough fascinates me, because I always deal with, talking with someone or getting to know someone like a scientific experiment. I think for reasons that, again, are kind of obvious. When you want to establish a relationship with someone, you want to know, well, this person. Say, when you're younger, you tend not to care so much because you're interested in different things, and or you're ignorant yourself. But I think, even at least from my experience, when you're younger, you look back at that and you say, well, I wish, I don't know, in that moment I had been more incisive, or I had kind of had more standards. Like when you smelled that, say, something wasn't quite like the expectation, but you somehow felt that, I don't know, you still had to stick to it because maybe you were insecure yourself, not losing the thing, and it was wrong since the beginning, but you still continued doing that. That's part of the, let's say, of the growing up phase, in a way that can last also pretty late, right? Until our mid-20s, our prefrontal cortex is not fully consolidated, so lots of interesting things happen accordingly. Then you start to make your brain work a bit better, if anything, because at that point especially you're keeping to work hard, and you are advancing in the stages of your occupation, whichever it is. You simply grow. You're more built, right? You have cultivated some kind of interest. Consequently, also from a scientific and moral point of view, you know how to handle things. There are also different levels of this. I mean, not everybody goes throughout the same path. As I often said, to me, age is not really an anaggraphic datum. I mean, there are people in their 80s that are reasoned like children still, and because they did throughout all their lives, arguably. And there are massive differences between people. That's, first of all, something that I think most people today freak out for, because of the aforementioned reason. Substantially, if you fear not, this is the problem, I think, generally speaking, to fail, right? And to fail socially, to fail relationally, means it gets down to fundamentally not being accepted as a person, right? So something that you cannot really term in other ways consistently. It's obvious that any concept of standard, right? So anything that has the capacity of objectively evaluating your personal value, accomplishments, whatever, scares you. Right, and the reason why it scares you preemptively is that by that point, by degree, you have, of course, learned how the thing works. Like, it's not the first time, again, as a naive youth, that you somehow encounter, I mean, somebody scolded you because you behave like an idiot or whatever, you somehow have grown aware of the fact that you're probably not of the brightest bunch by a degree. And then again, normally there is that phase of building up on that, like knowing that you have some deficiencies and you have to compensate with them with hard work, structuring something. And I would say that the beautiful thing of that aforementioned a genetic predisposition towards kind of making order out of chaos is that all humans are set on that base, right? Arguably, all animals as well. I mean, it's really a biological feature per se that there is not just merely a survival attitude, but something more, something extra, something that is aimed at maximizing your power, your control, life altogether. Because I think that's where it gets down to. It's fundamentally improving life also in its power, right? You can have many forms of life, but there is definitely a difference in the power, in the quality of the same, right? If you consider just in practice, from a biological point of view, entirely arbitrary, at least approximated the fact that humans are the most intelligent beings on Earth. Right? There is debate. Some people say that some big sea mammals may actually be more intelligent than man. Just we do things that these creatures do not do, that does seem to have a lot, in fact, to do with our capacity to deal with information and to systematize them and to have some kind of, in fact, social ghost that we, that allows us to reach unprecedented levels of power in the universe. And if you want to agree on the idea of a truth, right, and or even if it were just a token, like something that we invented per se, but there is no doubt that just in a biological hierarchy, humanity is tending heavily toward that direction, right? Imperfectly, because as I was saying before, we are all kind of, we come short of our own expectations. We know how much we could do. That's yet another aspect that we tend to somehow skip, in a way, the fact that we are physically and mentally using a minimal part of our potential, right? And that we technically don't even know, in a strictly biological sense, what the maximization of things like conscience, knowledge, whatever can lead to, right? Because traditionally that was thought to lead to divinity, and even to the, in fact, to a transfigurational capacity when the same matter was concerned. And there is a lot to play there with even our kind of scientific acquisitions. If you pick Einsteinian physics or quantum one, there are various branches. We talk about mechanics, etc. But let's say there is, it's as if there were there again mostly a material pattern that is the only one that at least has been taken approximately by science now. It's the only thing that we can measure, right? We can't measure things like life. We can't measure things like knowledge, right? Because at least our means there fail, or at least the formal ones that we have decided to intend, in fact, to limit science to by a degree, are the material ones. So, we have for example, we're alive, yeah, okay, but we also are conscious. What that is, scientifically, is completely unknown. There is no idea. We can measure, say, how some aspects of our brain work like, but we don't have practically any idea of how that comes to be, nor, in fact, how this could connect with our deeper kind of, in fact, connection. Like, how do we connect the fact that we are living beings in that regard with something that should be some fundamentally just from a material point of view stardust, but that is animated. The second part is not understood. I mean, it's very interesting that tradition, of course, observes the fact that life, say, that the spirit and the matter are all one, right? There are, of course, Gnostic heresies that want to make you believe that the two things are practically separated in a categoric sense, but it's evidently not the case, because everything that we do eventually affects the way we work, and it's not merely a matter of kind of wearing out just because of the function. There are, we're deeply psychosomatically, intertwined. And you can argue that we don't even know what this what the boundaries of this awareness really is, how we can simply understand each other, whether there is something truly more transcendental even in the way we affect one another. These are topics that, in fact, we cannot find an answer to. There is, of course, a broader awareness that say we are, for example, all interdependent as far as, even if I say one thing here, maybe from the other side of the world, this has an effect of some sort, so that we are all actively changing the world. And it's evident that the only way we think changes the world is just different shades of saying how irresponsible you want to be, right? That's essentially the thing. But what about everything we said had kind of a sacred value? In tradition, for example, those who said lies, who told lies, were meant to practically lose any credibility in front of the seriousness of course, of the absolute in divine terms, and they are people who lived even just 2 millennia ago. So, and at that time, such awareness was present. So today I will not even try to discuss, what was before that, how we came to be that, because of course tradition takes normally a completely different turn from what we are. We can scientifically reconstruct, right? So some things are theories, other are evidently not. So, but there are huge gaps properly in for whoever had just by studying history, basically, and that's the beauty of history, that even in heavily documented times, we know how easily we can macroscopically misassess things, right? This is not revisionism. It is simply, getting where history has not gone yet. It's, as, for example, I have experienced widely, for example, in my research, you simply know that there is a pretty obvious thing that goes on, right? Studying, the war of a certain European region in the Middle Ages, simply nobody has ever written about that consistently. So you can study that, and new things come about that when you confront with other, with our takes on, for example, the medieval warfare and or other aspects, let's say, of various times and places, make you reconsider the entire validity, not just there, because the things evidently happened, right? Even if we have problems reconstructing them, but how did we reconstruct them practically? And that's quite of a challenge, because when you go out there and you say, well, I found this out, and it seems to me to be actually a pretty mind-blowing thing, that the first reaction you often meet with is fear, right? It's not even, given that I've always gone by the book and nobody has ever kind of thought that my ideas were controversial, there are these things. There are certain scientific approaches that you can legitimately simply say, this is not how things work, right? In my case, it was simply not finding anyone who was a specialist in that, and so very often professors do not even like to admit that they don't know anything, or that their take can be, if it's not informed, maybe, as a matter of fact, pretty lame overall. So you may have problems with that. But that taught me how easy it is not to, and this is the point, that many people today comfort themselves with conspiracy theories, not because they have any capacity or intelligence or worthiness or whatever, just because they are scared as fuck, and basically they cannot accept that as individuals they are, first of all, the ones who cannot stop this going on, because if they lament that and they cannot basically change anything, the first thing traditionally is, if you have the truth wins, right? There are different philosophical attitudes regarding this concept, but if you observe all the various traditional approaches to this, I know we still live in a world where people believe according to stereotyping, I don't know, Christianity or Judaism or one another. That's nonsense. It's part of that kind of incompetence that we find at the bottom, that is to say, not having truly had the capacity to even, I don't know, can you criticize Nietzsche when he makes kind of anti-Semitic point? Because Nietzsche didn't actually know tradition very much. He deeply misconceived at some even advanced points of his life things like the Apollonian or the Dionysian, and it's obvious because at that time some of those things had not been studied yet, had not been found out yet, right? But somehow people continue also in the wake of some imperfect thoughts that incidentally are, and this is the interesting thing, they are imperfect as much as they degenerated over time, right? Of course, there is something that improves over time, but the capacity to comprehensively understand, master, handle a specific field of studies has, I think, decreased, right? At least our civilization formally has developed ways to be able to do it that before did not quite exist, but let's say the functionality of these same patterns came in parallel with just a dramatic easing of lifestyle that aforementioned psychophysical, collapse, I would say, at least for what the potential that is still intrinsic. Like we're the same. We have essentially the same biological structure of hunter-gatherers today, and people think that, for example, that's not the case. That's also pretty ignorant, as a matter of fact. But in general, we say, okay, yeah, we know how to do the thing. Yeah, okay, but have you ever done it? Ever? Right? Scientific, with the scientific tools that we have developed nowadays, have you ever actually, looked at a specific topic? The answer is no, because people are lazy, right? This is something I experienced in particular when I realized, especially before Schwerpunkt, when I was going on with my career, and I could do well formally, etc. But I realized I wasn't quite learning much by myself. Yes, I was a historian already, but what did I know, right? How much did I read, right? I just knew how to. I knew many things because I've always liked to learn many things outside of that formal path, and it was actually always very sensitive to that, because to me, I'd say even formal education was always falling short of expectations, especially in terms of standards of effort required and so on. And I think especially a subject like history forces you to know more. But in that sense, I also realized that more that you could do is, okay, I read this book and this other, but there is no kind of functional purpose to this. Like, I can read this or that, but what am I ever researching about this topic or not? So that's why, for example, a doctoral research teaches you how to reason in broader terms. That's something as far as especially conspiracy theories, some kind of takes on reality that we all use superficially, or that they're cliches, approximate, they're always, right? But there is an objective degree, right, that you can measure over time. They fell when I confronted myself with some scientific problems that I had to solve because I had to write about, that otherwise I would have never even taken in consideration. Well, needless to say, most people do not do this, right? They stop at levels where they think that essentially pasting and copying some stats from the internet without any method, without any hierarchical kind of evaluation, and essentially patching them together, just wanted to paint something in a direction, is a form of, okay, I'm an educated person, right? Or I understand these things, or I've read, or I studied, or I learned, or I understood, right? Or I'm an expert about this. This is the I would think by a degree it's a natural defense mechanism towards the complexity of the world for how it has come to be. That is to say, living in our times is pretty confusing if you do not have a compass on your own. And obviously you have to build this compass, and very often you can have severe problems in building this compass. I think to have been extremely lucky, because from one side I had a family that wasn't particularly ideological, right? Aside from some political rant, but for example, there was never a political doctrine behind that. They didn't care. My parents, in that sense, they didn't care. Why? Because they emerged from a world that had, after all, given them enough confidence to achieve what they wanted, just for what they wanted, individually, personally, and that obviously saw those who wouldn't succeed, like obviously doing so because of some specific problems, which are also things that we see statistically today. When people whine that there are certain categories in our community that, for example, earned less, the generalized attitude is we should make them equal. The question is why and how, right? Don't you think that there is specifically a reason why they perform less? And do you even think in some cases that the reason why they perform less is actually maybe what they want to do, right? That is to say, they deliberately choose without any pressure, without any strange kind of, unless you admit that they are fundamentally mentally ill or handicapped in some way, and of course there is no evidence of that, and they just want to say, okay, I want simply to work less. I know many people that are like that. Right, if you pick just, I don't know, think about your classmates, your former schoolmates, right? You perfectly knew them already at the time. The guy who wanted to study, the one that didn't give a fuck about that, and the one who had some broader ideas, the one who was just, superficial. And then you look at their careers, you look at their family background, and you realize that usually the people who had just already kind of an interest in learning, they were... They did their homework not because they liked it, but because they understood that doing it would help them in the future. Eventually succeeded. Eventually became doctors. They became scientists of some sort. They succeeded. They had kind of a more successful career or job, or they have less problems and are more developed people. Right? Maybe the others also succeed in their own ways, but at levels that where you still can see the fault, and for which you cannot really complain. I mean, if you stop studying, let's say, assume, okay, well, some people cannot study, that may be a problem. Again, I'm not going to digress on the fact, of course, if you are born with less opportunities, in a sense, of course, the outcome is also going to be different. But I'm for an equal, say, opportunity, more or less, that cannot be ever the same. But that you cannot correct at a private level, right? If you are born and raised in a family of drug addicts, well, it's obvious that you're going to be a wreck of a person most of the times, and or that you can even cope with that, you can even maybe successfully surpass that, but you'll always have kind of some extra burden for another person. I'm not saying how to solve this, but the problem seems to me that it always derives from degrees of personal responsibility that, in order to discipline, would become, of course, invasive. It would become, of course, they would also be fundamentally impossible to judge by a degree, because what kind of moral standards could allow a person to force another into some level of, okay, you have to pay an extra whatever for another person just because they were less fortunate, and how are those people even just going to earn that, right? We are incredibly materialistic. I mean, how are they going to use that? This stands on its feet only if you have a materialistic mindset, which is exactly the one that teaches further how not to have responsibility. Is to say, the problem why certain groups earn less is not because they work less or they produce less or they decide properly that they don't want to work or study or whatever, and how is that like even strange? I mean, it's pretty obvious that any person eventually is going to do something different. The only way to force people to be to do more in that regard, to balance, I think, should be teaching them how to do more and better. Right? In other words, to shock them to the point and say, I don't give a fuck whether you had problems, you're going to work. Because our psychophysical standards are of, magnitudinally greater than anything that an average person does today. It doesn't matter how allegedly mental difficulties or lack of opportunities. It's BS, right? Look at how just your grandparents lived. By far, it doesn't matter if you cannot, I don't know, if you struggle financially, today you have a low salary, whatever, you're disgustingly and scholarly more advantaged than anything that your grandparents ever did. Of course, there are exceptions. I mean, if your grandparents were particularly richer than you, you can argue that there is essentially a difference, but it's not all, right? Being richer has nothing to do, as exactly how it could happen also to lose money, with what is required to make things work, morally speaking, and especially how to maintain that, right? If you understand the basic principle of, in fact, the second principle of thermodynamics, you already know that we are basically, if we reason exclusively from a material point of view, we are doomed, right? So the only way to maintain standards in a system are spiritual, because we don't know what that is. Scientifically, at least, we there is a way to know it, right? We are so habituated to presume that by scientifically we can mean just a certain series of meters, right? Say of parameters, of factors, whatever, that we do not conceive that our sane mind is per se the measure of spiritual matters. And so it's pretty ridiculous and anti-scientific to pretend to solve a problem of material decay by causing, by work, other material decay without any other thing that keeps this thing going on, right? Which is in fact moral in nature. So that's the reason why basically any kind of leftistic, materialistic direction is doomed to fail by definition, right? This is not to say that in the political practice you don't need things like welfare, or that say our humanity is not wired also to stimulate even a part of our, in fact, materiality to act, but it's always mixed and indissolubly connected with spirit, right? So merely economicistic takes, like, for example, the economy is going wrong, so that's the first thing we should care about. Well, the reason why economy goes wrong, first of all, we perfectly know, depends on moral factors. Like, the market is incredibly emotional, incredibly cautious, circumspected, suspicious, whatever, and this is a problem. I mean, banally, if people weren't so paranoid and habituated to blame someone else for their personal shortcomings, the market, just our economy, would be much more florid in the first place. Now, the problem with tradition, so just not to sound as an hypocrite, of course, is that individually you are still always the first called to perform this. That is to say, I can also, for example, as Schwerpunkt, complain, people are so emotional, but what about you, right? What about myself? What about the fact that I could do more as far as, my work is concerned? I don't know about you personally, but when I wake up, I always think, like, what can I do today? Like, not to, and it's not much not to have wasted my day per se, but in that regard to cope with the fact that, yes, the universe is dying, and apparently the only beings that can do something about it, at least it's only life that can maybe fix the problem. This is the entire point of tradition as well. That is to say, the end of time, all these eschatological prophecies and so on, objectively get down to the idea that there is a struggle between not a dualistic good and evil force, just per se. And I'll explain better this now. But between spirit and the absence of the same. In other words, matter just per se. Matter is not an actual actor. Satan, this entire, in fact, kind of, you see, if you believe that there is truly another force that is acting as evil in the world, next to what we can think the truth, and so the maximum love of life, or whatever it is, and so the divinity in practice, you're deluded, right? The actual traditional take on that is that you are the one who should maximize that love, power, and life. And if you don't, because unitly you do have, as an incarnated being, some limits, and that's also what the entire Christian issue is, right? That Jesus achieved transfiguration, like the older heroes, right? With their a different context that was aimed at redeeming humanity as a whole, exactly because we had sunk so much that we had lost, apparently, but yet not deterministically, but just in an empirical way, the capacity of transfiguring ourselves. And that shows essentially how much you can do. Also in your human nature, right? So this is a very controversial topic, because you say, well, but then, so you think that there is a spark of divinity in mankind? Oh, of course there is. I mean, it couldn't exist otherwise. So that when you actually look at tradition, what it says regarding the dichotomy of Apollonian and Dionysian, you realize that in every challenge that is posed from, say, the dark side to the bright one, it would be better to say the darker to the brighter, right? Because there is always good and evil within them, if they are living beings, right? The point is that who is better rules over the other, right? And so the other, though, has all, and that's where we're also, and I'm glad when, there is still the true understanding of the Christian tradition, in that sense, that it's not antithetic. It's not a deterministic, pathetic thing saying, okay, just I can't save myself anymore. This came about later in modernity, with also the fact of the Protestant Reformation, that basically told you that works are useless. So you basically have just, for some reason, being up to some standards, but it's not works that can save you per se, because not even Catholicism had ever said that was enough. You always need grace, but just in the entire tradition, even before Christianity, which is actually the same thing, obviously you could not ever win any grace if you didn't act accordingly. So of course works do have an influence on your salvation. I mean, it's obvious if you deny that, and that's why modernity, in the deterior sense, started at that point, at least by approximation, what we think modernity was in our chronological scanning in the Western world, historiographical, and things started going downhill. You suddenly having in a few centuries, you have nationalism and socialism and atheism kicking in, and statalism and collectivism, and then to this point, practically nothing, right? Practically the single wealthiest, says not to say that there wasn't a civilizational up and down, right? You cannot argue even that there is a linear path to the abyss, right? There are so many, as we've seen, even within the four ages, there are exceptions, right? There can be, obviously, depending on what you can personally accomplish, like a rise, right? The idea that the end of time is going to come anyway, and Satan is going to rule the earth and all these things, is obviously referred to the fact that ultimately, if you do not stand up to that kind of weakness of yours and you let it win, you simply give way, you will lose the initiative, and you will lose the capacity even to accomplish anything along the way. And we know, at least that materially speaking, given that you are also made of matter, that is the tendency of your bodily dimension. And you can correct that, you can transfigure that, you can elevate that spiritually, right? So of course, there are ups and downs, right? And that's also why, for example, today we have nuclear weapons, why we are so rich, and why we have actually accomplished some hell of scientific standards and everything. The only problem is exactly that by relying too much on matter, just per se, with all the materialistic, technologistic prejudices and so on, we have grown weaker, so weak, as a matter of fact, that we just basically set the world on some kind of, not literally or by a decisive degree on autopilot mode, but almost by some degree. At least we decided that being ever lazier and being ever dumber somehow doesn't constitute a problem, right? There is no moral inferiority in saying, I don't know, I don't want to learn anything, or I don't want to do anything, or I don't want to act by any degree. And that, because that's okay, right? I should make an entire video to explain, how I see the thing. Of course, in a more kind of contemporary political and social way, right? Because I hardly, excuse me, I hardly ever get there. But because I think it's boring by a degree. I mean, you could explain it by making a history of, I don't know, the 20th century, or even the 21st, in this beginning. But that's not what I wanted to do today. What I wanted to do today is how this translates into in practice as far as you cope with people, right? It's just it's as if you were documenting an autoimmune pandemic, right, of essentially of a complete collapse of any, again, responsibility, standard, and necessary realization that in order to accomplish anything, you have, first of all, to suffer, by the way. You have to go against this constant decline, and that hurts, because the degree by which you have given ground is gaining ground again. And that obviously costs something. So also this idea, we should be completely desensitized to pain, to suffering. We should see everything like a terrible thing. By a degree, of course, by losing human value, by losing human connections, etc., we are, of course, much less sensitive to events like, I don't know, birth, or life in general, properly, and all what it entails, love and death, and so today it's as if, okay, well, we it's not really a positive thing to grow desensitized. The problem is, in fact, we lost the realization of what that means, and together with that, we lost also the power that this entailed, and what we could do with that, and also the scale of the tragicity of the thing, and thus also what would be needed to cope with that. So to tame this kind of dispiritment, I don't know even if it exists as a word in English, but I thought it sounded strangely dispiriting, perhaps. No, dispiritment sounds sometimes I create new words. However, the thing, in my opinion, is pretty clear in the onset. Again, it's when you approach someone, you want to know that someone for whichever reason. And the first thing that, first of all, I think appearances are crucial in everything, right? There is an incredible attention on appearance, on look, right? This is not a usual criticism like, of course people want to look good and they should be looking good, but there is a way to do that by actually being good, and thus looking such, and faking that, right? I could now digress by quoting Saint Jerome or things, but I will skip that because otherwise you think that I'm just I don't want to judge, I want to explain, right? Because without that you cannot judge, right? What seems clear to me is that nowadays, also whenever you look, obviously I speak from a conservative and traditional position, right? But I'm very dissatisfied, notoriously, but at least I've always been vocal about this, with current conservatism. I mean, given that I just care about that, because the rest to me is completely incompatible with any trace of morals or science, for that matter, is this attitude of, okay, just be part of our cool group. Kind of, it requires minimal higher standards, but after all, even standards here are not a big deal. But as long as you're part of this cool group, everything will go fine. You will not have to spit blood or sweat tears, which we should all actually do. No, you will just be part of the cool guys, and you will essentially be conscious of that. Just in your, you see, in moments of decadence, it's obvious that also. I can't speak from the fact that I was relatively always had an easy life, so I can't afford even to rest in some ways that some people can't do. So I do not expect to claim, I do not claim myself in the first place, that this doesn't have an influence in the way people reason as well. However, I think that the only way to prove that you are morally superior in that regard is always being up to your, at least to some standards of the ones that you claim, right? I don't know. For example, I work non-stop, like from the moment I wake up to the moment I go to sleep. Of course, I can't pick some time, I don't know, for taking a bath or, making, well, I think even physical activity, of course, fits within that. But it's kind of part of work. But let's say I don't have specifically other... Yes, I talk to people, whatever, but overall, the entire pattern, the entire picture is never even asking whether I have to work or not. I just have to, right? You see, of course, I'm pretty much against the concept that a person waking up every day at 6 a.m., then going to the office, working for 8 hours, and go home and handling their lives like that is just earning your meal. Right? I don't believe that. I don't think that most people who work nowadays actually produce the actual value, the actual wealth that they are, for example, retributed. Like, I think that we, of course, can afford that by some standpoint that is objective right of moral superiority worldwide that allows us to rule over, in general, even within our same communities, right, in ways that those who are, in fact, capable of succeeding, it's because, by a degree, we're better than the others, right? I don't make the claim that, again, just, what does it mean better, right? If you just see this from an economical perspective, say, well, this is immoral because there are many people who are richer than others, there are worse people than others. Yes, and who did tell you that economics is the only factor that you have to consider in a life's quality? Do you think that a person, just for being richer, feels better, was more privileged? I mean, you must be pretty dumb to think something like that. And why? Because you have been told, again, by somebody who's a dirty materialist or whatever, it's just the amount of money that you make that is actually the measure of your success. There are so many ways you can succeed, right? Even without being immediately wealthy, right? Or without being able to monetize immediately your value or your capacity. And or maybe, there are many reasons why that can happen. But, I mean, the story of the spoiled... rich guy was never educated, that is spineless and gets up bored and drugging himself and dying like an idiot and squandering all his money. I mean, it's pretty typical, right? It's not a farce. Just it does turn out that people who have adequate resources and know how to invest them and now know how to cultivate themselves and to work hard, we know statistically that they are just more successful people because, of course, they have been advantaged by a degree, but that has nothing to do with what was inherently the spiritual dimension of that. That is, who taught them that money is not everything and that you have actually to work your ass off in order to accomplish anything. That is intuitively the mindset of somebody who knows what money and thus the world is worth, right? Just per se, money is just a token again that we use to evaluate other wealth that we have in that sense of personal way, and that's in fact why it typically, again, the indicator of it's the rich, it's the evil people who have more. It's always coming from a background that at least is heavily biased towards a materialistic direction, and surprise, surprise, that often comes with actually, lack of virtue, right? There is not a single chance in the world, like, for example, why as a poor person you should be statistically more drugged or more, I don't know, dependent or something than another person. That's just a matter of will, right? If you are a criminal, if you are drugged, if you don't know how to make a family work, that all may come again from your background, but it's a moral choice. It doesn't have to do with the fact that you didn't have a better option than that, right? So you cannot throw money at that and saying that will fix it, because that person wouldn't know what to make with that money. And that's why saying people think that, I don't know, if you have an expensive car, you're rich. Right? If you're rich, you must have, you must go around with, I don't know what. Notoriously, that's the thing that always struck me, that the most driven car among millionaires is Toyota. And that, as a car brand, that tells you immediately how... in fact, it's always kind of stereotypically the case that the guy doesn't have any money but feels like a failure accordingly and has to show off. The first time he has an amount of money, maybe indebting himself, buys a BMW to show off because he feels to be inferior. And there is no car that is going to fix that for you, because there is no matter that is going to fix your moral inferiority, your personal inferiority. And that is the beauty of it. That said, I think that appearance is crucial, because when you approach someone, you can immediately tell whether they're trying or not to look more than what they are. I never, met a person who, let's say, had to look less than what they are, or at least less than what they could be. Of course, there are people and those are some of the worst type, actually the most dangerous ones. Very often there is a mental disorder behind that, and a history of pain, and very, disturbing kind of stories for the people that had to immediately point out that there are some sort of buffoons or some outcasts, and or that they have any fault, like self-induced ones, behaviorally, whatever it is, and saying, I don't give a fuck about this, I want to be like that. Well, okay, it's just people that, just eat like disgusting animals, become morbidly obese, and just pretend that they are normal persons. No, they're utterly disgusting people, and they should be ashamed of themselves. And the reason why they probably are so vulnerable in that regard is that they are ashamed of themselves, for whichever reason can bring themselves to do such a thing to themselves, which is stupid. It kills them, and it should be actually illegal by some degree, also because we pay for their healthcare, which is, I think, one of the reasons why you should say sometimes thank you to people that pay money for your irresponsible behavior. That's another thing in my life. Of course, I understand the logic of things like proportional taxation, all this stuff, but I've personally never seen in my life like a poor person saying, well, we should at least thank the fact that wealthier people pay a disproportional amount more of wealth for us to have, I don't know, whatever, right? As you know, in Europe things mostly work different from the United States, from which the majority of my followers come from, and I've never seen that attitude. On the contrary, there's always this kind of whiny bullshit that practically, but a rich person doesn't know what that money is worth. Who told you that? Right, considering the, again, overwhelming evidence regarding statistically the stereotypes that the, less, poorer people have, not just in terms of crime, any kind of misbehavior and so on, but in terms of what a rich person lives like and does, including the fact that, people that can, I don't know, okay, let's not talk about this, but let's say that even if they are also just normally the more educated, the people who accomplish more, and that actually have, by some conventionally objective standards in our community of which the others fall short of, like the more competent people, the more responsible people, the people that occupy positions of power because of meritocracy. And if this thing didn't work, our civilization would have crumbled, not gone up, right? The entire statement, again, this entire kind of negative attitude towards who has more is utterly ridiculous. And then you shouldn't actually be surprised that from the other side there is also contempt, because, if people were kind of more saying kind of thank you for that, well, you would probably feel something. I don't know why, because we don't live in a world like this, so I couldn't really tell. I just accept that. I think it's fair, after all. I do think that there is an obvious need, or say, not to be just mere treasurers, to say, okay, I want just to accumulate a disproportionate amount of money, not even spending it just for nothing. You should, of course, invest to the point that this thing, indirectly benefits all the other people. But I believe that happens by passing through individual power, not through, let's say, teaching people to live parasitically out of other people's accomplishments, as actually most people really do. And I can easily put myself even in this box, because, we are all heavily indebted to, if anything, for example, our ancestors in many ways. And this is kind of obvious because of that aforementioned kind of dramatic psychophysical weakness that we definitely prove today compared to even just people who lived a few generations ago. And that is not to say, well, this opens to great problems, because we shouldn't see people from the past automatically as any particularly better than the ones that live today overall, meaning that for that kind of civilization, yes, the majority of people was disgusting as well. So considering what others did and what the others did, you can immediately see in relative terms also how at the time was bad. But trans-temporally, we could say diachronically better, the thing is evident. Our grandparents were just, even if well-off, whatever, just set mentally and consequently also physically to achieve some goals that require just a substantial sacrifice that nobody today fundamentally is asked to do. And when things must be done, of course, you can pay a disproportionate amount of money to get that fixed. But if you don't invest in the, say, educational structures to make that person stronger with authority, discipline, and reason, you're basically going to end not just the resources, but you're also essentially teaching people to be weaker, so that they would have to spend further other resources to relearn what we have forgotten in the meanwhile that had already been found out, because civilization evolved by putting this series, kilometric series of patches over all the disasters that we did in order to get things right, at least to put it on the right trajectory. So what we're seeing nowadays, I think, in that form of, especially of appearance, immediately tells you that people do not want to be judged, even just apparently. They want to act as if you could fool another person on the base on how they, it's mostly a conformistic behavior. It's mostly an aestheticistic one, right? First of all, because it's cheap, right? You cannot fake a good job. You cannot fake a good qualification. You cannot fake even things that get down to genetics, right? Overloading yourself in makeup will not make you more successful while you're finding the right husband, because when the man will find out what you look like for real, he will say, what the hell is that? Right, and so that's also an interesting aspect of the story, that we somehow removed the genetic dimension from the. I think we disconnected it in terms of moral evaluation. Of course, this is obvious because we lived in times in which the genetic divide was seen by some degrees as just proving the lack of some kind of, say, proving a moral difference accordingly. This is a deep misunderstanding of tradition. I'm talking specifically about National Socialism. I mean, the concept that, they would exterminate essentially some races just if on paper they figured as such, and or genetically they had some kind of profile, right? Which was, it sounds ridiculous traditionally, because tradition tells you that first of all, there is always an infinite potential in human life, and that's why we preserve that. So the toying with the idea, for example, just of killing someone just because they find themselves in a specific condition, genetic or not, it can be from the idea of killing a baby in the womb to gassing Jews, right? Literally, there is no. It's always the same type of degree. It's how much you want to get rid of people that, for whichever reason, you think that they are somehow faulty, even when they are not. Evidently, in this thing, this is immediately denying the potential of human life per se. But what is even worse, by a degree, in traditional terms, is that tradition teaches that your bodily dimension can be transfigured. I mean, the entire point of divinity and all the kind of also what all the protomorphic kind of type of transfigurations of the divinity and so on, the various phases could assume is exactly what we say complain not being achievable by man. And if you basically determine that that's impossible, that to say, just if you racially divide people, these people cannot, you have a group of people who cannot achieve more, right? And so something that in absolute terms is better, you're basically destroying that same human potential, right? And in this sense, it's not that there aren't differences between races. It's obvious that, I mean, medically speaking, it's obvious the human races are a scientific approximation, but they do exist. There are different incidences in illnesses, in height, in many aspects, actually. And so you cannot deny that these differences exist, and obviously you cannot deny that they do not have an impact in terms of, which is the kind of more functional idea. You see, Darwinism fundamentally is based on the concept that there is none of that. There is no telos in it, because everything like in evolution would stem from a mechanical adaptation of the beings from whichever environment it is, so that you can have an environment that actually penalizes more intelligent people. The concept of what I explained up to now in terms of matter and spirit is that matter alone doesn't cause any further improvement. That is to say, you could have an environment that makes you like dumber. The question is, in that sense, how more effectively are you going to adapt to that environment? It may be just like an accident, right? And given that matter is deteriorating hopelessly, as we know, we explained before, the question is adapting to the environment anything positive, selectionally speaking, or shouldn't we instead fight against the environment? Because it's pretty clear from traditional mythologies that that's how the thing works. And it does turn out, and this is kind of, I don't like the term mainstream, but I will just use it to make people understand. Mainstream evolutionary biology is actually presenting us with the unequivocal evidence, which is presented as such and accepted as such, that behavior definitely does have an effect on at least the genes that we transmit to our children, right? This discovery and all the theory that can derive from it is still in its infancy. It makes you feel a little, a bit bad towards Lamarck, that naturally said much more controversial things, like at least conceptually. I don't know. Probably Lamarck was also more refined, and I don't want to know. I mean, even Darwin could be. I mean, Darwinism could be hijacked by Spencer and kind of biological racism, and so this categoricism that, as we've seen, is opposed to traditional transfiguration, and that's where, in fact, most of racism, the pseudo-scientific one, actually stemmed from, right? So, we are told now by science, with the capital S, that we do have, in other words, from a spiritual point of view, a transfigurational capacity. We can change our genetics on the basis of our behavior. We don't know exactly still how to do it, right, willingly, let's say purposely, but it does happen, right? And whatever this means, it opens an enormous, room for fitting, even as far as evolutionary biology, what the traditional understanding really was about. So, in other words, in order to say, if you categorize just a race, let's be honest. Even if you were to reason in terms of just you see, because race gets very often to some indicators, such as the color of somebody's skin, right? We all know biologically that pigmentation just per se doesn't actually tell us much, right? There are some genes that are dominant than others. The phenotype is different from the genotype. And I don't know about you, but if you go on the street and you meet the average person, whichever race they are, I think in average they look all pretty disgusting, humanly wise, right? So in terms of eugenetics, this is my personal opinion, but I think that it's something that I felt ever since I was a child. It never changed throughout all my life. Just I've lived, of course, in a culture that told me, like, well, we shouldn't tell an ugly person that they're ugly because it's not nice. And I understand that, especially when the ugly person behaves well. If it weren't for the fact that normally, complex people that I've met for different reasons, not just the ugly ones, let's say, do not tend, we know that statistically, to be as mentally, not just sane, but just, sociable and functionally so for a positive purpose than other people. And that's also another sad truth, that if you think about it, it's fair. Because, again, what chances do you have at that point just to improve yourself rather than just being angry at the world? I can agree that in practice, of course, if you are born with a severe problem, whatever, you're going to feel an outcast if you're isolated because people don't like. That's pretty dramatic. It's pretty tragic. I don't, let's say, at least in social convention, I don't go as far as saying, okay, well, that should be made a monster of, we should isolate him. But there is also even an evolutionary reason why instinctively we feel like that. I have some memories from when I was a child in school when there were some kids, there were tragic situations, but it's obvious that we, as other kids, we felt uncomfortable about that. And that, nobody told us, right? It's not that our parents ever told us, look, that person is different, so it should be treated worse because we tell you, right? The entire bullshit that this is cultural somehow, or even that if it were cultural, this doesn't have any obvious evolutionary connection, is exactly what people are telling you, that in order to trick you, right? In this sense of kind of paranoid, preemptive, passive-aggressive, in fact, kind of ultra defense, right? That becomes, again, all the more understandable as you objectively have some faults that conflict also with your capacity of being a good person, and to, of course, and I've met plenty of people, in fact, that succeeded in being actually much better human beings by even having evident genetic faults of some sort, and or others, by the way, that can happen even just out of behavior. There are people who just destroy themselves out of reckless choices, and then eventually they reason and they realize that they've done something very stupid, and they live with that. They can be much better people than, say, somebody who looks apparently good but behaves like an idiot. There is no doubt about that. However, the most painful thing, in my opinion, that I'm sadly also getting habituated to constantly, is finding people who have, in theory, all the right numbers to be, perfectly, say, not perfect human beings, because you would be a god, traditionally speaking like that, but say that have potential of different type, psychophysical one, as intertwined as it is, and that basically they wasted by regressing accordingly, right? For example, okay, let's not descend even in that kind of example, but it's obvious that, for example, if you were abused at some point, like it does happen very time. I mean, pretty girls are hit on constantly, right, by stupid men, because most men and most women are stupid, in case you didn't notice. So it's obvious that if there is, say, especially, men are on average stronger, whatever, they're more aggressive, they're more competitive, whatever. So it does end up with, very attractive women, independently from the fact that they're intelligent or not, to be harassed. And it does happen, right? The problem is that the reason why those men harass them is that they are stupid, because if you really want to succeed sentimentally, you don't have to harass, right? If you are stupid because you didn't receive an adequate parental upbringing, you're not educated, you're an imbecile and an idiot, or you're just frustrated because you look like shit and you want to try everything, and of course the woman is going to reject you because you're a lesser person. What's more than that? The problem is that in that sense, men are going to react in ways, if they are lesser people, they behave in ways that also traumatize women, often by abusing them, molesting them, etc. Right now, the problem there, you see, traditionally, is not just the fact that these men are misbehaving, but also that there aren't other men protecting women, right? Because at some point we decided that men and women are completely equal against any kind of scientific evidence in any field: neurobiological, evolutionary biology, anthropology, ethnoanthropology, history, sociology, whatever. But since people are growing weaker morally and they don't want to be judged anymore by anyone, even the same concept that there are these kind of differences and roles that are complementary, biologically speaking, has been removed. At least we're not taught about that anymore. And given that an important deal, and which proves definitely how much the spirit is important over the genetic matter, you could say like that of course teaching this tradition is the key to make people working better, and we can see it because I don't think here that religion per se is just a discriminant, because also most religious people, as most people, are stupid people, and not because they are religious specifically. But on average, at least in the Western world, more religious people are on average better off, right? They're more educated, they're more successful, they have more stable families, they have more income, they are healthier, etc. Right? So it's not just religion per se, but evidently there is some traditional structure there that makes even the appallingly disgusting standard of the average person, including the religious ones, kind of more functional when put on that track. I say this, by the way, because most people who consider themselves religious or even traditionalists, objectively today do not have the educational background or the parental background, in other words the standards also, to understand anything about what religion is, right? And specifically in that case also, of course, their own, right? Claiming to be religious or claiming to be traditionalist or claiming to be a conservative doesn't spare you from personal inferiority. It has nothing to do with that. It's the difference between wishful thinking and action, actual action, right? And of course, as I was saying before, this is a broader disease that has struck more or less everyone. This is not less present in, for example, there are very traditionalist cultures that are disgusting objectively. Why? Because you can be formally traditionalist. You can be formally kind of a religious country, whatever, but if personally you're just reduced to a superstitious mess, you're going to suck anyway. So for all those people who think that they can't be ransomed by the fact that, I don't know, they beat their wives because they read it in some religious text, just that you're lesser people who belong to an inferior culture, and that there is hardly anything at that point in your life, if you have been brought like that, to fix that, or at least there would be, but of course your same standards by scale do not allow you practically to achieve that, right? So the superiority of a civilization is measured by the degree of confidence. Whenever you exit the West, broadly speaking, you are acquainted not with, say, other cultures, with other values, with other things. That's the leftistic delusion of multiculturalism that you have been forced to level the odds. What you meet with is paranoia. First of all, fear, right? The concept that people are paranoid of their government because they have been schooled in being slaves all their lives. Poverty, ignorance, consequently stupidity, disease, and all of that. There is a very specific pattern in this. It's not opinable. There are massive macroscopic objective political social indicators that speak clearly about this, right? So you also cannot change the thing over time, right? It's not that if the thing in vogue among the Western leftists is transgender ideology, it means that the West to core is inferior to other cultures, right? No, it's still prominently and prepotently and deservedly above. And surely that's not a good indicator. That's surely the indicator of a mental delusion, of some deep cultural problem, which is the ones that I'm actually illustrating here. But this has nothing to do with having an objective standard of evaluation and being aware that there are cultures that are somewhere and some that are others, and you cannot make moral relativism about this. This is instead what you have been told. This is the interesting aspect, and to explain you how transversal this thing is politically. Both sides of the aisle normally fail, right? Because one side of the aisle is basically saying, no, everybody's equal, right? All cultures are equal, all religions are equal, right? As far as I'm personally concerned, there is not even a single person that is equal, not just to any other, and there's never been, of course, but even to his or her own self, just one instant from another. And thank God for that. The second one is, of course, that there is the aforementioned anxiety to portray this difference is non-existent, because if you teach people just to feel, say, less challenged and getting away with that, they will obviously instinctively enter that side of the store. So you will actually make them weaker for making them too weak for when they will have to cope with serious existential problems, to the point that you will keep manipulating them, because essentially they don't even know where to start from with how they should fix the thing at that point, and that's how you destroy a civilization. Equally, conservatives are not that bad. First of all, what we call as properly the far wing alt-right, or people told me there's no alt-right anymore. Yes, because people 4 years ago were like that magically, they all disappeared. We all know what that was, right? What you could think at the extreme right wing, people think that that's the hardcore traditionalism, and the leftists say, oh no, that's the people that like religion and force, whatever. I don't know how to tell you about that. Those people are socialists, if not communists. They are radical left-wingers. I mean, fascism, Nazism, just by the name, they're all socialistic. They all stem from socialistic, statilistic, collectivistic matrices, and this is the basics of their political theories and ideologies. Right? I still have to make that video about why the fact that National Socialists were actual socialists, and not just for the fact that they called themselves socialists, but even there, I think that if you want to point out, some logic, at least you do find it still paraded out there, because it doesn't take just to be a socialist to like any other socialist, in case you didn't notice. And, you can even study the history of the Soviet Union and see what would happen there accordingly, which is pretty instructive. But speaking of just conservatives, the idea is that it's the usual soft, kind of rotten, decadent malaise of abundance, say the disease of abundance, kind of take on the good savages. You don't understand anything about history, of ethnoanthropology, of culture, or literature, whatever, or a country, but you see like an authoritarian country that tickles your barbarism and tribalism, because basically you are coming less of the civic and rational standard of a superior civilization, imperial nature. You start siding with the rebel scum, and you say, well, those are true, they have true culture. Well, okay, it's not a post-socialist abortion without any degree of traceable first world education, or with astonishing mass of poverty. Actually, points of percentage of people they are living in slavery or anything. No, it must be they're fighting against globalism. They're fighting against the unipolar world. Whatever they actually think that actually means. Whenever you hear this word, just know that these people do not have a strategic education. Because if you believe that there are unipolar worlds, I think that you have severe mental problems and a lack of political, strategic, historical, and just mental value in the first place. The point though is that, of course, they, in order to because it gets to self-sabotage, right? If you back those lesser people against some people that in your lazy ass country you think should be punished momentarily because you want to crack on kind of a joke or a meme on social network, you're basically prefer to lower the entire standards, to give power to again, cultures that are inferior to yours, and that are actually based on much less, standards than ones you also yourself have. That's a pretty good picture of how eventually you can fall from a state of alleged superiority, and how, of course, tradition always tells you that in the moment in which you lower the guard, you're done for, right? You are basically losing the initiative and losing also your own power that must always be maintained, not to be achieved at some point and just relaxing, which everybody does, of course, by a degree, right? So the appearance of saying, like, I just look like, I'm such an interesting drinking person, like all these kind of social media poses of, acting as if you're so successful or good or confident, whatever, and you are just narcissistically focusing on a picture of something that is just per se and just transient, and that you're doing, of course, nothing to cope with, including by aging, just trying to fake that with some different pose or light or whatever, and not actually accepting the conditions in which you are, and doing by basically what every other kind of lesser person does. That's immediately a very powerful indicator that you're not actually succeeding in anything, right? I've found, unfortunately, sometimes on Facebook they tag me because videos circulate, and sometimes you realize there is an appalling amount of people who call themselves traditionalists and basically stay all the time on Facebook posing. Like, these are actually also males, and I actually do suspect there is some kind of problem with masculinity there, because a male that constantly parades his image, poses with some kind of even kind of half-naked pictures of whatever, saying, this is tradition, this is me, all these people believe to be Aryans according to them, and to be up to the standards of those people from thousands of years ago, and they're just obviously in an incredibly aseptic, lazy, kind of spoiled lifestyle, with just acting narcissistically, statistically like that. You immediately realize that those people are incapable of actualizing their self according to traditional doctrine, because they're basically they aren't doing shit, right? The entire point of tradition was to conquer the world, and wasting your time posting filling your entire Facebook imagery with, this kind of you taking selfies, in that way is just not just obscene and distasteful, and you should consider people may watch these things after lunch or dinner, and this could cause them digestive problems. But there is also some specific issue with your psyche, and you discover, maybe if you get to know this person, or details of whatever, that they failed maybe somewhere in their education, or in their, in the military, or they had expectation from fathers, they had, or from their parents in general, they had messed up families they were not up to, they had disorders, they are not educated, of course they're terribly ignorant, they just rant and rant, or other thing that happens very often. People were phobic towards, for example, Christianity, and they end up in this kind of alleged neo-pagan thing, of course, without having ever studied what those actual religions were, and not understanding them, they will actually tell you. Like, I am into this because I hate my parents because they enforced me Christianity. So in other words, they were abused. I don't know. I live from one of the most Christian countries in the world, and I've never seen around me. Of course, I know these things exist, but let's say from my milieu, I've never seen people forcing each other to believe, and never seen people discriminating each other because they didn't believe, or somebody was up to their parents' expectations because they just, maybe if you go in less socially advanced parts of the country that have problems on their own, and that evidently that there's not religion there in the first place, and again, materialism and superstition, and so not the idea of religion as actualizing yourself, but being under some sort of obscure force that you deem to be more powerful than you, then you do find those kind of things. And very often those people come from those backgrounds. I still, honestly, it's not that I've ever been much into neo-paganism myself, but given that I also teach history of religions, and that I study them, and I love the actual ancient religions that have nothing to do with what these people think, because they don't know it, but they are post-traditional nationalist socialists, right? Even doesn't matter what they think, they're right or left, they're all nationalist socialists, because there is no such thing like nationalism without socialism, and vice versa. These are radical red ideologies born on the ashes and blood of the Ancien regime. Right before, they were considered red terrorism, satanistic behavior, and not, again, in Christian terms, but even in ancient times. Right, so there were actual laws to prohibit this kind of bullshit to exist, because it pertained to the fourth estate. It pertained to the most superstitious, lowest scum of society. That's why these things were banned, like diseases, like by with the in Rome with the Bacchanalia. There were the illicit cults. We've seen this very often, right? It's all very, just like the church suppressed other, at that time, Christian heresies that basically were the equivalent of that. So this is trans-religious, depending on at least the monolithic and categoristic separation between alleged different religions, that, as you have been taught normally by living in this world. But this is what basically you witness. And interestingly enough, you never meet like a successful person among these people. A person who even just dresses up decently or looks decent or has legitimate interest. They're always either charlatans, people passing themselves from pseudo experts or scholars, whatever, self-publishing stuff they put on, at best, on Amazon, right? These kind of things, and or open kind of obvious fourth estaters, and given their background, given their look, given their whatever they do, basically you can say these are social garbage. And it's the interesting thing is that they've always been like that. I mean, if you look at every historical phase, first of all, these people never ruled anywhere, right? Not even during the communist revolutions. Eventually, what happened was this, right? During communist revolutions, at best, what happened is that there was an ideologized bourgeoisie that mobilized temporarily some fourth estaters for blind force and mass, and then the entire system sclerotized, became totalitarian, and eventually collapsed because, of course, cultural inferiority doesn't lead to any other outcome but self-destruction. So the interesting aspect, and there is a rebirth there. Often, at least sometimes, people say that was shit, right? But they often, if you are habituated to those superstitious standards, it's not, for example, by hating just the ideology that existed before, whichever it was, that will make you a better person, because you still have to learn what it means to be a better person. And if you are born and raised in a totalitarian regime, you do not know, because you have been trained not to know, and to actually fear the same possibility of the concept that you can be a better person. And this thing doesn't disappear in 50 years, in 1 century. These things, like if you have been under communism, under many other ideologies that fundamentally all head towards that direction from a socialistic background, you cannot erase it. There is a magnitude, cultural damage that, in order to be fixed, should bring to a massive re-education to again, with programs that, as far as I know, historically have never been enacted, right? And also because the ones that they tried to do in a larger scale so miserably failed, but also because, of course, there was properly no form to it, no substance either. So this is an interesting aspect. Like, most of the people that I could say, okay, let's give this person a chance. Let's try to talk to this person. Let's try to see if next to this kind of immediately, I'm not talking about these people that tag me, of course. I'm talking most about, I must confess, other experiences. Let's say the question is, let's give this person a chance. Let's see if they, next again to the faults that we all have, and being better, or at least feeling better than another person, if you have an objective meter of evaluation, also makes you in charge. Like, you are the one who are approaching this person to make them a favor, after all, to maybe age up with you, and so in a way that you can spend your energy success. Maybe this is a wrong thought. Maybe we should kind of also being ever more cynical and looking for people that are better than us somehow. But that's, I guess, what we all try to do, right? Even if we met people that are the same level of us, we would be satisfied by a degree. It's become very difficult to find that on a regular basis, unless you are to a level where, of course, that thing, as you see, gives rise to, family exploding, single motherhood, ignorance, undereducation, poverty, whatever. That's always, unfortunately, where the thing clicks, at least more often, because people simply do not have standards, so they accept whatever garbage they want to take in. And then, of course, everything fails, because that's the obvious consequence. And then people complain the system that is evil, and they start believing in conspiracies, and they alienate themselves. It's not their personal failure. It's somebody else. It must be the system. It may be some kind of invisible kind of phantom that they can thus also not be very, very, very precise about, because if they spotted the reason, they would have to actually go against that. Instead, they always tell you, no, this is the strong powers. It's the whatever, the elite, it's the other people who have been brainwashed, right? And it's not me, being a conspiracy theorist. It must be the others that have something. Well, why don't you start with yourself? I mean, just from a social background, right? If you're a decent person, was just, say, poor, but is act together, maybe you can act like that. You can address some problem. If you are a total wreck of a person, what does make you think that you see what the problem with evil is? That I don't believe that people are ignorant, just per se. I believe that people always know they can be better, and they do not make any effort to be so. They know they could do the right. They don't do it, right? So anytime somebody says something wrong, I don't think it's mere ignorance. I don't believe there is simple naivete there. I believe an adult person always knows that there is something wrong, and they just may be struggling with the fact that they don't fully understand the thing, but they perfectly know that if they don't understand something, that they should at least check that out before, so that if they're wrong, maybe they spare other people the consequences of their own irresponsibility. Instead, no. Right, and also this all kind of mass conspiracies that, why are disadvantaged people buying this more often? Right, of course, if you are under greater strains, you have more fears, in a sense. You're more vulnerable, arguably, but this shouldn't be the case, right? If you can fortify yourself morally, right? I realize that fortifying yourself morally requires, again, knowledge. And that is difficult to find, but at least why don't you start step by step? I realize that your situation is more emergential than others, that you need things faster, that you live in a condition of instability, of uncertainty, of insecurity. But at that point, if solutions cannot arrive easily and quickly, because all civilizational solutions cannot be achieved like that, why don't you start from your attitude? Why don't you start from the fact that you should stop warring by a certain degree? We know that happens. Also in war, like people initially are terrified by it, and then they're horrified by the risk of being killed. But then we know after, von Clausewitz says, half an hour of front line where people are exploding next to you, you basically continue to be scared, continue to of course, to consume a lot of resources, but you fundamentally adapt, because there's no other way to stay there. And we know that humans can make it. It's terrible, it's terrifying, but that's the degree by which a person can withstand literally the worst things that can happen to them nowadays. So just being, in a disadvantaged position to you is enough to screw up civilization, because you're jealous that others are up to standards that you cannot afford. That's disgusting, and then you should not be surprised why people at certain points say, I don't give a fuck about you, because objectively you're not worth it. And I don't see any way around that. It's pure logic, right? And reason, as a matter of fact, because also what's the help in fueling, in flattening your thoughts there? Just essentially keeping you being an idiot, right? The thing is also, with some people, even behaviorally, you can't even fix them on the spot, right? If you lacked an order, a structure, whether you can't change that in 5 minutes, or even in 1 week or 1 month, right? That's a problem that must be addressed for a lifetime of disaster. And at a certain point, most people say, well, okay, but I have my own life to make blossom, especially if it is one that has better tracks and more potential, so that my output there can help more different people than just this one specific. Then maybe, you can argue that love has a transfigurational capacity in that way, and personally, individually, if people like each other, it can happen. But there is also a hard rock there that you must, you cannot ignore, right? That's also what many people really do, right? They ignore the problem, even those who are more kind of compassionate, and they want to help people. But I admit it's easy, right? There are people who are kind of like children, and they are easier to be addressed with, a more permeable degree. It's difficult when you have people who are supposed to be developed enough, but they have started entrenching in some positions that evidently correspond to the state of moral stagnation that they decided to remain in. So that's why it's more difficult with that. And I would like to address two other aspects of this. Appearance really tells you a lot, right? Especially people who tell you that have to stress the fact that they are so more intelligent, or they're always they were always the first of the class, or that they have to prove you that they know this and that. I know literally that there are people who start listing you things. That opened to show, look at how much I know. I did this, I did that, I always talk about this, about that. There are people who do this, for example, with their parents, right? I think I had terrific parents, but say when I meet someone, especially in sentimental terms, I don't spend all my life saying, oh, look, oh my God, my father's such a great person. I learned this, I learned that. And you talk just about it. It happens with friends as well, right? The worst, in my opinion, are, by experience, the people who want to force friends to be family as such. You have to accept this person's friends. Can't you, if your friends are so great, why don't you at this point think that you are so great? Or why do you have to constantly talk about them just per se? What do you want to do? You want them to give me a job, or to, I don't know, to higher up my life, or no, of course, that's something, they're friends, they cannot be touched. It's just, that they mention it. And what they have to say is that they have special friends, because otherwise, evidently they wouldn't have anything else. And you meet these people, sometimes they're the same usual garbage, sometimes even the worst. They're, arrogant, kind of unaccomplished people who have to pretend they are good at something that they aren't. And I have plenty of stories about that. So you realize that you have you're dealing with a mythomaniac person, right? A person who fixates that something is so good and so great, even though, and that, of course, points at the fact that it's not transcendental. I mean, how can you be... I've never understood this in my life. How can you be satisfied with something merely human? Like, I know that we are so faulty in this regard, but if you have properly a scientific hierarchy, you also perfectly know that average people are just average people. Like, I can listen to great minds speaking. I'm very thankful having met certain people in my life. I'm very thankful for my family, whatever. But even in front of great personalities, you hear them mostly for what they're good at, and then it's not that you have to create a mythology about them as people. It never occurred to me. I've never had myths to follow. Never had to follow that scientist or that football player. Of course, not a person I would ever follow for that man. Or you can, I would say, you can appreciate them if you get to know that they're also maybe, I don't know, they have a good family. He seems to be a responsible person, or all these kind of things. But then you go on with your life. Like, it's not, you don't make an idol out of that. When it says that, probably the difference between venerating and idolizing is that when you venerate someone, it's because you have a pretty good idea of what that person is, and that kind of spiritual standard also makes you keep it for yourself by a degree, because what the thing is there for is to educate you, right? Not to... You can, of course, and you should speak highly of that, but not making of something that is also not just by absolute terms the solution to everything. Like, oh my god, I can't do without that thing, right? That is also often happened. You read in this description, it's always the same old story. Also, ever cheaper activities. I love so much music, and so what do? I listen to music, and then they listen to, terrifying things without any kind of artistic value, and say, so you love so much music, you think this was a particular trait or interest in your personality, in your character, and then you love so much music, and then how do you love it? Are you an actual musical expert? Do you know how insightful are you in kind of musical understanding? Or are you just listening to music when you go to work on a bus in the morning on your headphones? Because that's not a merit. Like, loving something means that you can dedicate a body and soul to that, to a level that is higher than anything else, right? And or what do you like to do? I don't know. This kind of completely generic, unsatisfactory thing. Or the worst is pretending to have, I don't know, I love languages and you can't speak any decently, or you never tried. Or I love, I don't know, other cultures. What do you know about these cultures? Zero. Even the ABC of the most elementary historical notions of those peoples and those cultures, you don't know. So what the fuck do you actually know? You see, this is part of the shield, the defense, and the mask, right? So why don't you say, well, I just like this and that. I mean, you sound immediately less pretentious. The fact that you need to pretend that you are so much about this thing it just means that you're lying to the face of other people into making them think that you have some kind of higher special standard that others should consider in coping with you, and that evidently does not exist. And that if you point out, this person immediately gets paranoid and somehow doesn't want to listen. Guess why? Because they are scared, again, to be judged. In other words, they're scared they're failures. And so they do not accept. They will go around saying, there are these jerks that do not accept you, but you're stronger. On Facebook sometimes now, unfortunately, they sponsor you pages that you don't even follow. And it's always the picture of a wolf that says, other people don't understand me. It's better that other people not come my way. So yeah, basically teaching you how to be a passive-aggressive sociopath that is incapable of taking any kind of criticism, or maybe wondering if there is something really wrong with you, because you say at least the world where you live allows you to just become ever more of a, hiding yourself in somewhere, being completely alienated from reality. And it's never like, there are always wolves and lions. There's never caterpillars or lambs or whatever. No, it's always this sense that you must be some kind of aggressive animal, full of virtue, that is so strong and inspiring, charismatic. And under these photos, you always think, yes, it's so true. Yes, it's right. It's exactly what happens to me. Whatever. You also, just by a mere look, you realize that that's the humus, that's the substratum of some of the lowest scum that doesn't have any other type of doing that. Or you would say that you look at these things. Well, of course, I'm kind of flashed them. And what strikes me is just for the few times I'm flashed with these things, the only thing that comes up is that there is zero criticism, zero philosophical approach, zero, but maybe it's me. But maybe, this kind of mental, indoctrination is dangerous because it's completely subversive regarding any moral, scientific standards of objectivity, right? People who criticize now are the problem. It's not maybe people who fall short of standards that are the problem, that cause the whole system to slow down, to jam, to collapse. No, it must be the ones who have standards and tell others to move their asses that are the problem, right? So that you become the evil person that must be countered. So you see what happens there, that whoever has power, whoever has actually obtained quality or standard, whatever, is, it's not necessarily it's broke down, right? Nobody but yourself can bring you down. What happens is that these people are told to be ever more passive to it. That is to say, avoiding confrontation, avoiding facing the reality of their own fall. And so being actually ever more exploitable, which seems to me actually a pretty actually fair. Like I believe that everybody should be better, of course, in that kind of quality scale. However, once the thing happens, of course, it's better that these are the people who get down, right? Than anyone else. So I don't think that there is even just a much of a problem about that, because I can't tell you. I'm just describing the thing. I'm not purely blaming anyone, except in the sense those who are capable of making the difference, which is everyone technically, but especially the ones who have more insight, for not talking about these topics. I think I never heard a person listening say to so many different, even in the conservative commentaries and so on. There is not really a figure who says, "Look, yes, you should get your act together, tidy up your own room," but they never tell you how much you must spit blood and sweat tears. Or that's the problem, because the leftists will tell you, but in order to do that, I have to spit blood and sweat tears, and I don't want to do it. And what I tell you instead is that I want to do that, because I know that when you do that, you actually get something that really is priceless, and that you cannot get in any other way, right? So that's why I also think that conservatives today do not make actually any good job. They're just entrenching themselves in their own safe space and pretending that everything is fine as long as they teach people to be part of their group, but without actually asking for any standard. If not slightly more than, of course, what a leftist can have. Like that's the thing that, and I stress here that the leftistic ideology is fundamentally based on that flattening of any standard, because everybody must be forcefully equal, which entails the destruction of any other of any merit in the process, but also of any kind of pre-existent difference that can make that merit taking form, right, by the cooperation of different people with different capacities in a complementary way, which is actually what civilization really is, right? So that's an important aspect. The other one, I would say, this was the premise. The first concept that I wanted to say of the last two is method, right? Another thing is, of course, the moment of debate, and the one of, let's say, confrontation properly with these ideologies. Like, what I noticed stereotypically is the following. So first of all, we should never think to be fully right, because if we own the truth, again, we wouldn't be even momentarily human at that point. We had already transcended or something. So our knowledge is always imperfect. Our way of expressing ourselves is always imperfect. And even knowing lots of things but not being able to express them is actually a fault that we should take in consideration. Also, we just know by default to be dishonest, right? By a degree, I know when I debate, whether I try to, as you understand in these videos, to explore all the various niches, etc. When you debate, often you do not have enough time, so it's quite difficult to address all at once everything, right? That's also why I make such long videos, because understanding things is really complex. It takes time, especially if you've never understood certain specific aspects. One thing you notice though at that point is that, of course, what the argument should be about is essentially presenting a theory that works. Because if you want to go by empirical terms, like, it's pretty difficult to find exactly the only thing that explains a certain fact, right? You have at least a mix of things, and you should point them out, and should also explain philosophically where you come from with that. I think that history prepares you excellently to that, because you cannot say just that there are different historiographical currents, and you cannot just say, okay, history is just socioeconomics, like normally the Marxist-oriented one is. So when you explain, I don't know, the Industrial Revolution, you explain it on the patterns, I don't know, of capital or wealth distribution, some kind of just merely it's mechanically also happening without much of a different, thinking behind that, or just as a consequence of that. And instead, so no period scientifically, and that's what I was saying at the beginning, even for the so-called hard sciences, no topic of some kind of importance, or any importance for that matter, can be simply framed like we have just one interpretation of this, right? Also because knowledge must be applied. You can even know how much gravitational acceleration is, but what do I do with that? I must know how to apply this information to a certain knowledge, and there may be situations, I don't know, we know inverted gravity exists, for example, in some places in the universe. So there is always behind that something bigger. That shouldn't make moral relativism about the thing, but actually teach you how to frame things in ever more complex form. I think when you meet with the average person today, it's very rare to find someone who has a complex way of thinking, and consequently a method that they can use to navigate themselves in this information. Most of them is just either making up how things work, which naturally is very convenient in some ways, and or let's say using moral relativism, that is to say, okay, I will say this glass is half empty instead of half full, or vice versa, so that it will just try to subjectively shift your view and distract you from the objective measurement to say how much water there is in that glass, which we have grossly, let's say, the capacity of ascertaining. From the other side, there is something else which I found very Baconian by a degree. That is to say, whenever you have a point you want to defend, like so always talking about what these people really do, is that they pick, right, also because it's very easy on the internet, a series of, say, stats, right? You can say, I don't know, I don't like that this group, for example, performs in a certain way, so I will find all these stats of people whose work I don't know, whose in fact texts that I haven't read, that I don't know how it was born, and on the basis of which data and with which method and on which pool and whatever. But I will say, look, this stat say that. I list 10 and I pretend to make a point with that. So methodologically, that's quite dumb, because the person who is used to work scientifically on complex systems and theories immediately sees that this method doesn't lead anywhere. You may have gathered that information from anywhere. Usually this information, just like stats, numbers, data, whatever, is just like they used as punchlines, as pure rhetoric to say, okay, what can you pose to that? Well, normally people do not know stats by heart. They just know more or less how things work. Maybe they adjust it in their mind just a bit like they want. But again, if you want me to play the same game, you can do the same exact thing in 5 minutes on the internet and quoting the sources and not even checking them. Of course, in order to have an actual understanding of these things, you must be at least like an expert, somebody who read the articles, who had, let's say, a prior competence in those specific fields. You may also not have them, right? But at least you should be a developed person who knows how scientific publishing works, how you can handle a data, how you can handle a statement. I mean, nowadays people, I don't know, there is an authority who states something, and the sport and social networks is saying whatever accusation is false, whatever omission of any context and or of distortion of the phrase itself, and just using it as a punchline. This is what most of the social media discourse has gotten to nowadays. You can pick literally any information for the infinite one you can find, building up a mini theory, showing it to a person who of course doesn't know anything about that, and that person will say, oh my god, I've seen this. And then of course they haven't read any source, any method, they don't know how that information has been put together. Or maybe they want just to believe it because that person says something that sounds like the one they want to believe, again, because they're paranoid, because they have to invent there is a magic enemy that goes against them. And that how it really works, right? The interesting side of the story is that this paranoia seems to be more rooted in the sense of a sort of moral entitlement than any other thing. Like, this info is not meant to actually fix anything in practice. This is just to say, maybe in my safe space, whenever I see someone arriving that I don't like, I want to feel morally entitled, like with the charisma of a barking chihuahua. Just as far as this minimal engagement is concerned, this is just like as a small skirmish, as opposed to massive, powerful theories that are like a full, field army that can simply smash anything along the way. And the interesting thing is that adult people, like average, people who can be parents, who can vote, whatever, normally seem to reason according to this pattern. And when you actually explain them, look, there is a context here, you cannot say this because actually there is no proof of what you're talking about, because this information is framed, and very often, for example, stats do not give the causes of something, and or very often just the simplicity of this mindset is based on the very often the reversal of the assumptions of the broader point that they wanted to make, that very often betrays itself. Right, and that's why I also say that very often, always actually, nationally you can have, say, different inclinations for how they believe, but nationalists are always socialists and vice versa, right? Because the point they really make, even as far as, sex differences, or it can be many things, countries, differences, whatever, are always rooted in some sort of communitarian delusion that they must be in control of their own version of the world that must always be reconfirmed, otherwise they will go into full cognitive dissonance and denial, and entrench even more, withdraw even more, where they cannot be touched even by that. If you wonder why there are so many suicide rates, other mental illnesses, also increase in obesity, and in lots of other issues, actually even more serious ones, like claiming to be non-binary or whatever, which is something that does actually exist, let's say, but it's just like a 0 point something of the population. Now 40% of people actually believe to be, and all these kind of things. Just know that these are, of course, are self-inflicted mental disorders, exactly produced by this kind of weakness that fundamentally derives from a spoiled background. Let's say from the fact that somebody either incentivized them to think they're better people than they actually are. I mean, this fact of accepting everything and everyone without criterion is, of course, detrimental, because most people, of course, I mean, every person is different, and so if you're not willing to accept that we are all different and not equal, you're always going to push some, especially of the lesser people, to think that they are more than what they are. And so as soon as they meet with the harsh reality that they are not, they will not have, it's not that they will not have the capacity to cope with that, but they will also nurture resentment, because of course they were deluded enough to like to pretend that they were like all others. And that's why mental diseases occur, because there is a lot of terrific and actually terrible energy involved in the process. I mean, you have, first of all, to lie to yourself, and then you have to start to keep pretending that other people are the problem in order to go on with this mental disturb. And in general, there are people who exploit you like this. I mean, one of the easiest forms of abuse of historically, traditionally, is let's say misleading people, right? It's just like, I don't know, Hansel and Gretel, like, the witch tells him, oh, look here, it's all nice and tasty and infinitely so, and then just I want to cook you and eat you, right? And that's obvious, because you can never have the easy solution. You can never have whatever you want. You can never have everything if you at least do not work like hell for it. And obviously the weaker, like all in those traditional tales, it's normally the children, it's normally the naive in general that becomes the victim of this, right? But they also get a big scare, and at least there is a moral, because there is always an authoritative figure that steps in the way, and that, I don't know, kills the wolf or all this kind of thing, and that represents a model of authority, of virtue, of reason, and of discipline, right? And all these that are archetypically also the virile figure that has been practically emasculated and eliminated from the horizon is exactly the issue. Then you don't, if you wonder why, well, there are interesting stats that I cannot, in fact I should explain just to prove you that I don't quote them just by chance, but again, at least the ones about mental illnesses are microscopically everywhere nowadays. So that is a good example of how if you destroy the archetypal meanings, you cannot practically get anywhere. You always have a broken toy. You cannot have such a thing like outcome equality without significantly damaging the human nature of people. And that's why people cannot accept, again, things like, I don't know, that there are mental differences, there are value, and the moral dimension, that is the material dimension, is difficult enough to understand. Most people, even materialistically speaking, they don't really understand how physics works, and they just follow. They say, I like science, and against those damn bigots read the Bible, and then all they do is just they put like on Facebook pages that show pictures of black holes, right? And they don't understand shit about that. The point being that the spiritual, the moral dimension is by far more complex than anything that we can sort out materially, just by mathematical complexity. We don't properly even know how to deal with that, except with actual experience, with human behavior, because our mind is the only one that understands that, and that is supposed to make things work. This is the entire mechanism on the base of which tradition is founded. And if they found out, from mostly this is Marxism, that the best way to destroy a civilization is, of course, depriving it of moral value. If you make a person more stupid, they will simply be able to do less practice. It doesn't necessarily win, because humanity does have a spark of divinity, as we've seen. So it can always be reprogramming. You can, of course, destroy some human beings like this. It's being done still today, but widely. But and I'm talking also from a physical point of view, to buy their own delusions. But there is always a possible comeback. You cannot immediately just control thought, right? The idea also, why are conspiracy theories saying that people are simply by accusing the establishment, is that there is a single thought that you cannot say something against what the other says, that it's all false, that they misplay with the truth, because lesser people by default must think that there is something like the possibility of controlling somebody's mind in a comprehensive fashion, because they first of all do not understand how far the complexity of human mind can reach. And if people could simply control each other, probably at this point we would all be dead in a way or another. Would have not evolved even civilizationally. Would be completely different beings biologically speaking. But secondly, they cannot afford to accept that, of course, they do not even come close minimally to the truth themselves, because they are scared by the eventuality that they have to be more mentally developed people. And they must deny that there is something more complex than what they think is going on, forcefully. And they're scared. Like, you realize that the reason why, for example, the social networks are flooded with this is that they are the ones who need to escape the most. They must leave on social networks. They must vent the valve in a place where they can hit and run, right? So they can block easily. They don't have to confrontate reality. They don't want to interact. They want just to shout out, because they hope that their tiny comment among hundreds of millions a day will have any relevance while their life is disintegrating, right? That is actually a pretty widespread issue and problem. So trying to make a person understand that things are more complex than what they are when they themselves have never known how complex something could be is a challenge. And that's why very often their entire strategy to avoid this is to claim that there is basically no authority from the other side, that it's the people who are the true heroes there, because they are martyrs, and the people at the top are so evil, because they are intrinsically denying the value and the necessity of a hierarchy, of an authority, of an order, and of a reason, and of course of a knowledge, of a wisdom that they don't have. And that's why all civilizations developed in a hierarchical sense, and why hierarchy is the first thing is being attacked nowadays. People don't want more merit. They're scared by merit. They're scared by quality. They're scared by work. They're scared by effort. They're scared by competence. They're scared by expertise, because they know they will be smashed by that, because they don't know shit. And so they stay away, and they just try to undermine the entire system, hoping that it would fall when the only ones that are falling is them. Admittedly, this has some consequences, negative consequences, only in as much as, of course, these people can set, I think, a broader mood of uncertainty. Like, if you live and if you're raised in a world where people constantly fear, just like these people, of course you will grow weaker. That's why people from countries that had totalitarian regimes are properly weaker. They're more scared, they're more aggressive, more emotional, because they cannot understand what's going on. They're just habituated to be exploited unfairly, and to be abused, to be repressed, and they have always to and they do not have really a compass, right, to distinguish quality and value, and that's why eventually also, let's say, the superior civilizations are hated worldwide, because properly those who are under cannot understand what it means to be up, because they properly don't understand the mechanism. They must be stolen somebody else's money to do that, right? There is no other way. The concept of merit, of transfiguration, of kind of imperial values, no, that must be a problem, right? And the only way to solve it is to make everybody equally poor, equally stupid, equally ugly, right? And so pretending that will solve their problems, as if they didn't have a chance themselves to be better human beings, or something that can be, at least started to be called as such. And that's actually the background from where they come from, because they literally don't know the difference. Another aspect that I would like to point out is the rationalistic approach to reality. Now, in this sense, I would like to point out that I've been brought up in my philosophical culture as a rationalist myself. At least I studied consistently history and philosophy, to the point that my favorite thinkers back in the day were figures like, like Aristotle, like Thomas Aquinas, Descartes, Kant, etc. Right? So it's not that I didn't like Socrates or Plato, or going on with Augustine, like Weber. Like, of course, everybody left Hegel, right? Just to make you understand. So over time, in that sense, I will not explain now. The thing is too long, because it went on for years, and I also changed during those years, and so it's normal sometimes to be more inclined towards a direction rather than another, and this kind of things. But let's say I grew old with the full pack of confidence in knowledge, in science, in intelligence. So I was lucky enough, differently from the generations that are entering the world today, that everything can be fixed, right? I don't know if you are born with the idea that nothing can be fixed. You're basically done for. Like, I hardly can see, in fact, any hope for a person who, at least there's always a hope for anyone, but let's say in the outlook that pretends that everything is doomed, right? And of course, without even knowing why, because in order to answer that question, you should be also pretty much either you're a materialist, and so you think, as we were saying, that everything will end just because we know matter. Another thing is saying at least there can be a doubt about that, and the doubt stems from the fact that we don't know practically anything about what life is, or what's going on, our consciousness, whatever. And those are questions that, incidentally, we know also were always being debated, humanly speaking, and that the more, let's say, effort also in the build-up of our civilization chronologically, the attitude towards that kind of confidence of sorting out things morally occurred exactly at the peak of civilization. That's why, for example, I think I have that rationalist background, because I think in the second half of the 20th century, most young people, at least, were brought to believe that was the case. Not always. I'm not saying that I don't like the 20th century much, even though I was born in it. But of course, it was much better before in line of principle as theories. However, I can measure myself that kind of faith, not much faith in reason, but at least in the say, being aware that reason is always a tool that you can use in order to sort out reality. It's possibly the only one, so it's not much of a fating reason. There is not a reason somewhere, unless we don't talk properly about the logos as God. So what we are trying to find out, to explain together with the universe and ourselves. So reason is not like, again, like a form of scientism, like most people see science today, just like a pool of magic information that is allegedly always true, even though we perfectly know that in different parts of the universe certain things work in a different way, and we're still trying to sort out how they do, right? Because evidently things are more complex than we thought. But a method, again, something you must use to sort out things. When we look at conservatism, I agree that there is a degree of mystic sometimes that is based purely on some sort of emotionalism. I mean, I think most conservatives, fellow conservatives that I know, believe in certain archetypal values, not because they actually understand them or they perfectly handle them or they actually can explain others what they really are, or teaching them or whatever, because they just want to feel, again, in that same sense of my group is the cool one and I don't want to be threatened by whatever is outside. So effectively preventing yourself from knowing more and setting yourself some limits. That is a risk. I don't like it. I believe that there is some kind of as a historian, for example, I attribute an enormous importance to the value of intuition. I believe that human mind can come up with certain ideas continuously that are really precious and worthy, and even when you know a few, you can really get somewhere with your mind that can help finding out lots of stuff, right? But I also need proof, facts, evidence, logic, right? I cannot say fool myself into thinking that whatever I feel is the case, because I know that if I didn't have this kind of rational armor, backbone, I would incredibly easy prey of many suggestions that are false and are fundamentally undermining me somewhere, right? In specifically the concept of the tribalistic primitive man that is the most instinctive one that we have, but that, as we know, at least for most historical times documented, were actually some of the most underdeveloped realities that weren't at all even living by the standards of the Apollonian civilizations, and that for some reason that I cannot explain now actually was even popularly believed to be so, at least especially not surprisingly in nationalist and socialist times, in a way or another. The hero there is either the tribesman / peasant for both nationalists and socialists, right? So you should point out how, as we were saying before, that without authority, that is the one you should have, right? So not something looming over you like a superstition, but an anarchic society is also you should be God to be alone and powerful, and the only way through that is hierarchy, order, power, right? If you live on a piece of dirt, working the same dirt to survive, and you just live in a weird place where you die like flies, and you just raid on each other's farms, that's not power. That's pretty much the epitome of misery and a lack of power and capacity. So it's hardly anything that we should go back towards. But instinctively, we bond more with Ares than Athena, even though Athena always defeats Ares all the freaking time they fight. Because again, it's easier. Because our material nature, the lesser element, brings us down to those depths, right? And so it's very easy sometimes to be categorical, and also from the other side trying to rationalize and thinking that only reason must be used, and or only this instinct must be used. the truth is that you cannot do without both, right? You cannot just rationalize. We've seen it very often in our history of warfare videos that the most successful military cultures were the ones that were very disciplined, but also very individual in some way, so that they knew how to channel the individuality in the collectivity to sum the powers of both. Instead, and this balance is very rare historically. Like, we rarely see it in action, and all civilizations tend to be, let's say, at least if we remember them, it's because they had something to it. About it. But most of the times they're just like, easily shipwrecked, and they decline very quickly. So there's much to be learned historically, and I will not digress on it now. My admonition stands for those people who take everything in a rationalistic way, right? When people say, "Oh, but you're against individualism," and you're against, however, also kind of collectivism, so what are you, right? As if individualism or anything ending in ism was a value. Having an individuality doesn't have to mean that you have to be individualistic, right? There are two different things in plain English, and I don't know if you understand that. Being rational doesn't mean to be rationalistic. Reason, in that sense, and just like realism, reality is something, right? But realism is another thing, right? It's basically, ism is present in any circumstance you want to basically insist on a specific factor or a single aspect, right? That you attribute too much importance just per se. You think it's this or that. It's very brutal and primitive, scientifically, methodologically, because monofactorial explanations do not exist. Basically, they just tell about you that you're too dumb to reason in more complex terms than monofactorial aspects. There are, of course, certain things that are more important than others, such as moral forces, but you don't have to be a moralist in that regard just to pretend that and it depends also on what, because what does it mean that you just must have the right morals, or that you have just also to act upon them? They're all different things. They must be ascertained and appreciated. Rationalism is a bit, I think, one of the most, I wouldn't say it's the most insidious problem of our times, because it's evidently not. Actually, wherever there is reason, that is a built, a cultivated capacity, right? Not just something immediately there, and that tradition helps passing down. However, you may be tempted still to use reason, adapting it to the shortcomings of the current reality, and specifically pairing it with the aforementioned materialism. That is to say, for example, if you read, say, a passage in the Bible or in any other mythological text or whatever, and of course there is an archetypal meaning in everything that is written there, and at least it's an historical product of a specific thought, a specific culture. You must be very, very, very aware of what philosophically, literally, scientifically that means. Well, the tendency is, from some conservatives especially, they're the only ones that read these things arguably, but this happens also in the Bible, of course. For leftists sometimes, and liberal, for anyone, that every explanation must be reduced to it has to be banalized in a rational sense, right? Just yesterday I was listening to a guy that I normally like very much, but I know that he has his shortcomings, saying that, for example, the episodes in the Bible in which there are giants, angels that copulate with the children of man, fundamentally, and you have the explanation there that normally goes, that these are sort of heroes, right? Or some of, in that case, Mesopotamian versions of, Achilles or Perseus, that were the reminiscence, of course, of the idea that there was an age of heroes. So a moment in which humanity was still wired to the divinity, to a consistent degree of standard that they were considered also, different, right, or in quality in a way, and we all are again. So there you can already make the case, that the strong case for some kind of true reference to standards that were lived at that time, that this thing was just a sort of mockery instead. I don't remember how it was actually explained, as if, this was a mockery that in the Old Testament was made of older religions, as if, copulating with this lesser beings, or was a proof of, I don't know, lack of moral standards or something, and whatever. It may even be, by a degree, like, it depends on, of course, in a monotheistic or in a tendentially monotheistic context, you can make it, but even though this is eventually hybrid, because as long as angels were around, there have always been there has always been a single God, right? These would be all some sort of fallen elements that were manifesting like that. But it's obvious that you cannot rationalize the text, say a text like the Bible, by saying just that we can normalize these people were simply, other cultures that were seen as, were being joked upon, as if angels were not seen as terrible, etheric, as much as heavenly figures at the same time. That were exactly the symbol, at least, of this mixed reality of fallen kind that still, however, remain in between God and nothingness, and that the value of angels in that biblical passage is much more advanced than just something you can rationalize to some simple people who lived like at the time. That the thing does not exist, and you have to think that the Bible, in this sense, is just metaphorical, at least to the degree you can rationalize everything of it into something you can explain only through the physical world that we accept today for what we have been able to discover, and not something beyond it. This is particularly important, I believe, because I realize how important that rational skepticism is. We always should, and this is where most religious people fall short of expectations, always doubt when we don't know. There cannot be humanity without doubt. If you're still human, which is not necessarily a positive thing, bear in mind, human means dirty, comes from humans, it means that we are the ones of the dirt, right? You're by default incapable of fully believing. It's nonsense to pretend that you do. It's actually sacrilegious to pretend that you do, because you're pretending to put yourself at some standards that you do not have, and that you are, as I was saying before, trying to pretend that you actually have, without even knowing what that actually means, traditionally. So it's a way, of course, of recovering your own personal capacity of evaluating the thing without having to believe others, right? And if you skip that passage, you cannot improve yourself. You can just keep fundamentally remaining to a standard and keeping yourself under a superstition, that standard that you decide that you cannot surpass really is, right? Thus, what is the take on this? The take on this is that it's obvious enough from the unlimited possibilities of our life, the incalculability of our moral dimension, and all what obviously we don't know about the material world as well, that ruling out morally and scientifically anything, especially of the nature that our tradition discusses, I think is dangerous. First of all, it's not a scientific principle. I mean, science tells you that whenever something is discovered, and we can basically it's always an empirical measurement, because we can trace laws, theories on the base of the scientific measurement, but as you know, these things can change. I mean, if we find that something works differently at some point, science, the true science, the high culture science, the best of science, tells us that you must change that notion, because that's what the true scientific spirit really says. Equally, you cannot say that something exists if it's not demonstrated, as much as you cannot say that something that is not demonstrated does not exist until it's demonstrated. As a consequence, yes, it is fair to believe in things that may be, and that, of course, you cannot represent, like, I don't know, interviewing exorcists that say, we are the cool guys who handle with Satan, and Satan is just, after us. He's just an actual thing, and you see people crawling over walls like lizards. And yes, you cannot take videos because it's forbidden by the church, and actually making people believe this bullshit, right? The true satanic moment there is, first of all, making the lie pass, because if these things were true, we would have already documented them, and we know that in a scientific sense, right? So it's not that, again, it cannot happen, but we don't have any evidence that by the degree of the shortcoming and the gullibility of people and the dishonesty of people, this cannot be made up. Secondly, Satan is lack of knowledge, right? And so it doesn't developed from like some sort of active reality that is out there, like an anti-god, if not metaphorically, right? And so for somebody to believe that there is actually demons that enter physically people's bodies, I think it's denying, it's actually giving power to a dualistic, heretical view that doesn't have anything to do with the actual traditional view. That is, the only problem that we have with ourselves is that we decide ourselves to be under certain standards, and so we don't reach them while matter degenerates. Now, I'm not saying in absolute terms, I mean in this case, that you can prove this or not, but the question is, believing in things should always be done independently. You're not a better person because somebody tells you to believe something. It's because you're a better person if what you believe, you have had good reason, an approximate reason at least, to believe on the base of what you can know about the world. The more you know about the world, the more you see how it works, because you take control of it. And this does not include ridiculous statements about things that are not present anywhere else, and that, surprise, surprise, manifest just behind closed doors with nobody documenting them, right? Nobody knows why. The devil would be scared to do so. Like, what's this bullshit, right? And so only, being weird and having problems and being, taking certain stands would be the proof that the devil is there. But of course, people crawling over walls, it's always, during closed doors with just a bunch of people without education, without kind of even moral standards that can tell you. The thing is, that is created to give the delusion to the simple people that there is somebody that is guarding them. And this doesn't give them any kind of true autonomy. Right, because it may bring them to cope with certain realities, perhaps, but unless they don't try to find out what the truth is there, and I've never heard anyone who insisted too much on that path, if not trying to frame the thing metaphorically, then there are those ones that for some YouTube view tell, yes, I've seen people levitating and all this thing. Well, good luck with that. I would sin if I believed that was true. Right? If I saw it, I wouldn't. All right. But if I didn't see it on the base of our scientific knowledge, I'm actually being a virtuous person. Contrarily, because I can't provide you a set of information of stats explained at the roots with causes in a broader comprehensive theory. What that's not the case, which today I'm not going to do because it's taking a lot of time. But this is actually the point. The broader point I was making is that do not try either to rationalize, because this was the counter argument. But the point being, I'm actually telling you, never try to rationalize everything. Just, this is what I've already seen, so it must be equal to what I've already seen. There is too much that you haven't seen, especially there is too much that you haven't known. So never understand what you don't know. Never understand what can come and blow your mind, because you actually do know how it works. You already went through that. You already seen that, right? It's not a surprise that people think some stuff and then they find out it's different. It's how we learn anything, so you already know. When you're a child, and you can understand why people lie and why they have the reason to lie. Rationalizing everything because you just said, well, I haven't seen anything different from today, it's not very just very useful. You can think it about strange narratives of people that often turn out to be motivated, to be in kind of altered mental status, to be full of shit, essentially, and other stuff. Just doubt legitimately of things that are, in this sense, unlikely. But don't think in that case that you don't have the capacity of finding out and judging accordingly, and even properly to take a stand about that. Because if you have a good reason and that is closer to the truth, you will still make mistakes, but it will be correct, right? Making up ideologies because you're politically or socially frustrated, and believing in conspiracy theories because you believe that you live in a world where there are terrible people who want to take you over. Well, just know that by doing like this, you're letting take him over. Because you're just becoming weaker and weaker mentally, and you cannot afford anything else but this kind of paranoia that you're just using as a shield to confrontate with the fact that you're a failure. And this is relatable, for pretty much for anyone, right? Not just for who believes specifically the most in vogue conspiracy theories. But always remember that the more simple people believe something, the less likely it is to be real. And there is actually a very specific reason for that. You should understand, if you know what, in this sense, kind of standards are, at least. Alright, so for today we'll stop it here. We'll keep talking about this stuff sooner or later, because I stopped addressing them at some point, but I also somehow require to say myself to frame, because I believe that everything I learned historically would be unspent if I didn't explain how people really behave, and if I gave the impression that we just don't have anything to learn from anyone, and that we can simply approach data without explanations, and letting people again believe that they can essentially know everything they want without effort, I wouldn't be a historian either. Right, so for today I really stop it here. Just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. I thank you always heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.